The divorce papers were still lying on my kitchen table when my phone started ringing. It wasn't my ex-wife. It was my older brother. The moment I answered, I heard laughter coming from the background. Then he said, "Well, looks like she finally realized you weren't worth staying with." A few seconds later, my mother's voice joined in. "I told her she'd get tired of carrying you." Everyone laughed. Every single one of them. They weren't comforting me. They were celebrating the worst day of my life. I quietly ended the call, sat alone in the empty house we had once dreamed of filling with children, and stared at the wedding photograph still hanging on the wall. That night I promised myself one thing. I would never waste another second trying to prove my worth to people who enjoyed watching me break. They laughed when my wife walked away. Exactly 1 year later. None of them were laughing anymore. My name is Bongani Afolayan. I'm 37 years old, and I was once a successful civil engineer in Kigali. My former wife, Imani Safako, and I had built a quiet, comfortable life together until years of work pressure, emotional distance, and misunderstandings slowly pulled us apart. Our divorce was painful, but it wasn't filled with hatred. What hurt far more was my own family. My mother, Adonai Becky, and my older brother, Tendai Chirwa, believed my failed marriage proved I had always been a disappointment. Instead of helping me heal, they turned my heartbreak into entertainment. They had no idea life was preparing a lesson none of us would ever forget. The day my divorce became official, I packed everything I still owned into one old suitcase. A few clothes, some family photos, my engineering notebooks, and the wedding ring I could not bring myself to throw away were all that remained of the life I had spent years building. I walked into a tiny apartment with cracked walls and barely enough space for a bed, a small table, and one chair. The silence inside that room felt louder than anything I had ever heard. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks earlier, I had been living in a house filled with dreams about the future. Now every corner reminded me that everything had changed. I hoped my family would comfort me during the hardest time of my life. Instead, every phone call became another painful reminder of how little they believed in me. My older brother laughed and said I could not even keep my own marriage together. My mother told relatives that my divorce proved I had always been a disappointment. They ignored the years I had worked hard to provide for my wife, the sacrifices I had made, and the love I had once poured into my marriage. To them, none of that mattered anymore. All they could see was a man whose marriage had ended. Their words hurt more than the divorce itself. Every joke and every insult felt like another heavy stone placed on my shoulders. There were nights when I sat alone looking at the empty walls, wondering if they were right about me. I questioned my worth, my future, and even the man I had become. But deep inside, a small voice refused to give up. I realized that if the people closest to me could not believe in me, then I had to believe in myself. That painful season changed something inside me forever. I stopped waiting for my family's approval and stopped trying to prove that I deserved their love. Instead, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would rebuild my life one small step at a time. I did not know what my future would look like, but I knew one thing for certain. From that day forward, I would depend on my own strength, my own faith, and my own determination to create a better life. A few weeks later, I made the hardest decision of my life. I packed my suitcase again, locked the door to my tiny apartment, and accepted a job managing infrastructure projects in another province. It meant leaving behind the city where every street reminded me of my failed marriage, and every family gathering ended with another insult. I wasn't running away from my problems. I was giving myself one last chance to build a future that no one else could destroy. The work was far from easy. My days started before sunrise and often ended long after the sun had disappeared. I spent hours visiting construction sites, checking blueprints, solving unexpected problems, and making sure every project stayed on schedule. Some days I returned to my small rented room completely exhausted, too tired to even cook dinner. But for the first time in a long while, I fell asleep knowing I had accomplished something instead of replaying painful memories in my mind. Being away from my family changed me more than I expected. There was no one laughing at my divorce. No one reminding me that my marriage had failed. My coworkers judged me by my honesty, my leadership, and the quality of my work, not by the mistakes in my personal life. Little by little, the confidence I thought I had lost forever began to return. Each completed project reminded me that failure in one part of life did not mean failure in every part. Every bridge we repaired, every road we improved, And every family that benefited from our work gave me another reason to keep moving forward. I slowly remembered the ambitious young engineer I had once been before pain and disappointment had taken over my life. I still had difficult days. Sometimes an old photograph or a memory would bring back the sadness I thought I had buried. But instead of letting those feelings stop me, I used them as motivation to work even harder. I realized that healing was not something that happened overnight. It happened one day, one decision, and one small victory at a time. Without realizing it, I was no longer just rebuilding roads and buildings. I was rebuilding myself. And this time, I was creating a life that was built on strength, purpose, and hope instead of the opinions of people who had never truly believed in me. One afternoon, while visiting a community development project, I met someone who would quietly change my life. Her name was Nokuthula Dubé. She worked with families who had lost almost everything, helping them find shelter, jobs, and hope again. Everyone in the community spoke about her with deep respect, not because she was wealthy or famous, but because she never turned her back on people who were struggling. There was a calm kindness about her that made everyone around her feel seen and valued. Our first conversation was short. We discussed the housing project and how better roads and stronger buildings could improve the lives of local families. But there was something different about talking to her. She listened carefully instead of waiting for her turn to speak. She asked thoughtful questions and genuinely cared about the answers. It had been a long time since I had met someone who wanted to understand me instead of judging me. As the weeks passed, our work brought us together more often. We shared ideas, solved problems, and spent hours discussing ways to make the community stronger. During lunch breaks, we talked about life, dreams, and the challenges we had both faced. I learned that Nokuthula had lost her husband several years earlier. Instead of allowing grief to make her bitter, she had chosen to dedicate her life to helping other people heal. Her strength was quiet, but it was impossible not to admire. For the first time in years, I felt comfortable telling someone about my divorce and the pain my family had caused me. I expected the same pity or criticism I had heard from others. Instead, Nokuthula simply listened. She never interrupted, never blamed me, and never made me feel ashamed. When I finished speaking, she smiled gently and said, "Your worst day does not decide your whole life." Those simple words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. Slowly, our friendship became one of the brightest parts of my life. We encouraged each other, celebrated small victories, and reminded each other that healing takes time. Around Nokuthula, I no longer felt like a man defined by a failed marriage. I felt like someone with a future again. For the first time in years, I wasn't surrounded by people waiting for me to fail. I was standing beside someone who truly believed I could rise again. Even though my life was slowly getting better, my family refused to see it. Every time they heard an update about me, they found a new reason to laugh. If a relative mentioned that I was managing important construction projects, my older brother would shrug and say, "He's probably just doing small jobs. If he was really successful, he wouldn't be living so far away." My mother would nod and add, "A man who couldn't keep his marriage together shouldn't expect life to reward him." Their words spread through the family until everyone repeated them as if they were facts. Sometimes my phone would ring during family gatherings. I already knew what was waiting for me on the other side. There would be jokes about my divorce, sarcastic comments about my future, and laughter that made it clear they still believed my life was over. They never asked if I was happy. They never asked how my work was going. They only wanted another reason to remind me of my past. Then they heard that I had become close friends with a woman named Nokuthula. Instead of being happy for me, they laughed even harder. My brother said, "No successful woman would choose a divorced man like you." Another relative joked that she would leave as soon as she discovered who I really was. They acted as if my failed marriage had erased every good quality I had. For a moment, their words brought back old doubts. I wondered if they would always see me as a failure no matter how hard I worked. But instead of arguing with them, I made a different choice. I stopped trying to defend myself. I realized that people who enjoy putting others down rarely change because of words. They only change when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. So I returned to my work with even greater determination. Every project I completed, every family I helped through better housing, and every problem I solved became another quiet step forward. I didn't need to announce my progress or prove anything during family arguments. My success would speak for itself when the time was right. While my relatives wasted their energy laughing at my past, I spent mine building my future. They believed my story had already ended. They had no idea that the best chapter of my life was only beginning, and soon the same people who mocked me would be forced to see the man I had become. Exactly 1 year after my divorce, I woke up expecting an ordinary day. That date had once filled me with pain because it reminded me of everything I had lost. But this time my phone rang with news I never imagined I would hear. My company had chosen me to lead one of the country's largest sustainable housing initiatives. Out of many experienced engineers, they trusted me to manage a project that would provide safe, affordable homes for thousands of families. For a few moments I simply sat in silence. The same man my family had called a failure was now being trusted with one of the biggest responsibilities of his career. The project was more than just bricks and concrete. It was about giving struggling families a fresh start, just as I had been given one. Every decision we made had the power to change someone's future. I worked harder than ever, making sure every house was built with care, honesty, and quality. My team respected me because I listened to them, solved problems calmly, and always put people before pride. As the project grew, newspapers and television stations began sharing stories about the new housing initiative. My name appeared in interviews and community reports, not because I was chasing attention, but because our work was making a real difference. People I had never met thanked us for giving their families hope. Hearing those stories reminded me why I had never given up, even when life felt impossible. Nokuthala's organization became one of our most important partners. While my team built homes, her team helped families settle into their new communities by providing support, training, and opportunities to rebuild their lives. Together, we were doing far more than constructing buildings. We were helping people believe in tomorrow again. Working beside Nokuthala made every success even more meaningful. We celebrated each milestone together, encouraged one another during difficult days, and shared the same dream of creating stronger communities. Our friendship grew even deeper because it was built on trust, kindness, and a shared purpose. Looking back, I realized how much could change in just 1 year. 12 months earlier, I had been sitting alone in a tiny apartment, believing my future had disappeared. Now I was leading a project that would improve thousands of lives. The people who laughed at my lowest moments still knew only my past. They had no idea how greatly my life had changed, or that an even bigger surprise was waiting just around the corner. One rainy evening, after another long day at work, I was sitting quietly at home with a warm cup of tea when someone knocked on my front door. I wasn't expecting any visitors, especially because very few people knew where I lived. The rain was falling heavily outside, and the knocking became louder. When I opened the door, I froze. Standing in front of me were my mother and my older brother, Tendai. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. They looked completely different from the confident people who had laughed at my pain 1 year earlier. Their clothes were wet from the rain, their faces looked tired, and the pride they had always carried was gone. My mother avoided looking into my eyes, while Tendai stood silently with his head lowered. I invited them inside without asking any questions. They sat down quietly, holding their hands together as if they didn't know where to begin. The silence in the room felt heavier than the storm outside. Finally, my mother took a deep breath. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Bongani, we need your help." Those were words I never thought I would hear. Tendai slowly explained what had happened. His business had collapsed after several bad investments and trusted partners had betrayed him. The debts had become impossible to pay. Creditors were demanding money every week, and the family home was about to be taken away. They had borrowed from relatives, sold valuable belongings, and exhausted every option they could think of. There was nowhere left to turn. As I listened, memories rushed back into my mind. I remembered the laughter after my divorce. I remembered the phone calls, the cruel jokes, and the way they celebrated the worst day of my life. Part of me wondered if this was the moment they finally understood how deeply they had hurt me. My mother wiped away tears and quietly admitted that they had been wrong to treat me the way they did. Tendai could barely lift his head as he whispered, "I never imagined I would be standing here asking you for help." The same people who once believed my life was over were now sitting in my living room with nothing left except hope that the son and brother they had mocked would choose kindness instead of revenge. And in that quiet moment, I realized life had brought us all to a turning point none of us had ever expected. As my mother and Tendai sat quietly in my living room, neither of them knew that someone else was in the house. The silence was so heavy that even the sound of the rain against the windows seemed louder. Before anyone could say another word, footsteps came from the kitchen. A few seconds later, Nokuthula walked into the room carrying a tray with hot tea, fresh bread, and small plates for everyone. She smiled warmly and greeted them with genuine kindness, as if they were honored guests instead of people who had once laughed at my deepest pain. "You must be cold after being out in the rain," she said softly. "Please have some tea. It will help you warm up." My mother looked at her in surprise. Tendai could not even hide the shock on his face. They had expected to find me living alone, still broken by my past. Instead, they found a peaceful home and a woman whose kindness filled every corner of the room. Nokuthula knew everything about my story. She knew how my family had mocked me after my divorce. She knew about the cruel phone calls, the laughter, and the nights I had questioned my own worth. Yet she showed no anger, no bitterness, and no desire to embarrass them. She poured tea into each cup with the same respect she showed every person she met. The room became painfully quiet. My mother held the warm cup with trembling hands but could not bring herself to take a sip. Tendai stared at the floor, unable to meet either of our eyes. I could almost hear their thoughts. The woman they believed would never choose a divorced man was standing right in front of them. And she wasn't only successful and respected, she was also kind enough to serve the very people who had celebrated my suffering. After everyone had their tea, Nokuthula smiled gently and said, "Everyone goes through difficult seasons. What matters is how we treat each other during those moments." Her words were simple, but they carried more weight than any accusation ever could. No one had an answer. My family had arrived expecting to ask for help, but instead they were receiving something they had never offered me when I needed it most: compassion without conditions. In that quiet living room surrounded by silence and kindness, they began to understand that true strength is not shown by winning arguments or mocking someone's failures. It is shown by choosing grace when you have every reason not to. For several long moments no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the rain tapping against the windows. My mother held her cup of tea with both hands, but she never drank it. Her eyes slowly filled with tears as she looked around my home. It wasn't a huge house or a place filled with expensive things, but it was peaceful. There was warmth, respect, and kindness in every corner. I could see that she was beginning to understand something she had ignored for years. Finally, she looked at me with trembling eyes and said, "Bongani, I owe you the truth." Her voice cracked as she struggled to continue. "For so many years, I believed success was about appearances. I thought a perfect marriage, a big house, and what people said about our family were the only things that mattered. When your marriage ended, I didn't see your pain. I only saw what I believed was your failure." Every word made the room quieter. She lowered her head and wiped away her tears. "I never stopped to remember how hard you worked. I forgot how honest you were, how respectful you always remained, and how often you put other people before yourself. I judged you by one painful moment instead of the man you had always been." Tendai remained silent beside her. For the first time in my life, my older brother had nothing to say. The man who had always laughed the loudest could not even look me in the eyes. My mother continued, "Today I walked into your home expecting to ask for help. Instead, I found something I never gave you when you needed it most. I found kindness. The woman beside you welcomed us with respect after everything we did. And you invited us inside without reminding us of our mistakes." She began crying openly now. "I spent years believing you were the weakest member of this family because your marriage ended. But today I see the truth. You became the strongest one. While the rest of us were busy judging you, you were quietly becoming a better man." Her words touched me deeply, not because they erased the pain of the past, but because they were honest. She finally understood that character is not measured by whether life goes perfectly. It is measured by how a person chooses to live after everything falls apart. At that moment, my family realized the greatest failure had never been my divorce. It had been their refusal to see the son and brother standing in front of them all along. Looked at my mother and my brother for a long moment. The pain they had caused me had not disappeared. I still remembered every cruel joke, every phone call, and every time they laughed while I was trying to survive the hardest season of my life. I had every reason to turn them away. I could have reminded them of every hurtful word they had spoken and told them to face their problems alone. But as I looked at them, I realized that revenge would not heal my heart. It would only create more pain. I took a deep breath and quietly said, "I will help you." The relief on their faces was immediate. My mother covered her face with her hands and began crying again. Tendai looked at me in disbelief. He had expected anger, not mercy. Over the next few days, I carefully went through all of Tendai's financial records. We sat together for hours, sorting through unpaid bills, business debts, and contracts that had caused his company to collapse. Instead of criticizing him for his mistakes, I helped him create a realistic plan to recover step by step. It would not be easy, but it was possible if he stayed honest and disciplined. Since my parents were about to lose their house, Nokuthala and I offered them a place to stay until they could get back on their feet. We welcomed them into our home with respect, not pity. They had their own room, shared meals with us, and slowly began to experience the peace that kindness can bring. I also reached out to trusted friends and colleagues who were looking for reliable workers. Before long, I helped Tendai find an honest job where he could earn a steady income and rebuild his confidence. It wasn't the business empire he once dreamed of, but it was a fresh beginning built on integrity instead of pride. One evening I sat down with my family and spoke from my heart. I am helping you because compassion is stronger than revenge, I said. But we cannot go back to the way things were. Respect must exist in this family from now on. If the insults and mockery return, my help will end. They both nodded without hesitation. This time there were no excuses and no arguments. They understood that forgiveness is a priceless gift, but trust must be earned. In that moment, our family didn't just begin rebuilding their finances. We began rebuilding the broken relationships that had nearly been lost forever. A few months later, our family gathered for dinner again. It was the same dining table where so many painful memories had been created, but this time everything felt different. There were no whispered jokes, no mocking smiles, and no one waiting for another chance to embarrass me. The room was filled with a quiet peace that had never existed before. As everyone took their seats, I looked around the table and realized how much had changed since the day my divorce became official. The food was ready, but before anyone reached for their plate, my mother slowly stood up from her chair. Her hands were shaking, and tears were already running down her face. Everyone turned to look at her. Even the children stopped talking. The room became completely silent. She took a deep breath and looked at every member of the family before her eyes finally rested on me. "The day my son lost his marriage," she said softly. We laughed. No one moved. We believed his life was over. We thought his divorce proved he was a failure. Instead of comforting him, we judged him. Instead of standing beside him, we pushed him away. I was his mother, but I failed him when he needed me the most. Several relatives lowered their heads in shame. No one could deny her words because they had all been part of it. She continued, her voice breaking with emotion. "Today I understand something that I will regret for the rest of my life. My son's marriage did not reveal his failure. It revealed ours. While we were busy laughing at his pain, he was quietly becoming stronger. While we chose pride, he chose humility. While we judged him, he chose to forgive us." Tears filled the eyes of several family members. Tendai stood up, walked over to me, and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Brother," he said, "thank you for giving us another chance when we didn't deserve one." I smiled quietly because I no longer needed apologies to prove my worth. Life had already done that. As we finally sat down to eat together, I looked around the table one more time. The laughter that had once celebrated my downfall was gone forever. In its place were respect, humility, and gratitude. That dinner became a reminder that a person's worst moment should never be the final chapter of their story. Sometimes the people everyone counts out become the very ones who teach the greatest lessons about strength, forgiveness, and unconditional love. Some people mistake someone else's heartbreak for the end of their story. But life has a remarkable way of rewarding those who choose healing over hatred and growth over revenge. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe a person's worst day should never become someone else's entertainment, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs the reminder that true strength is shown by how we rise after heartbreak.